The child's eye is the gateway to its imagination. The pictures it sees and the texts it reads shape its learning and intellect. One of the oldest ways of combining words and pictures for repetitive learning is the nursery rhyme. They are sung and danced, and children remember them into adulthood. Their origins go back centuries as rhymes, catches and ballads created in the wars by soldiers, by drinkers in taverns and by gentlemen in bawdy houses. Most of them are English and weren't called nursery rhymes as such until the early 19th century. They have been turned to time and time again by illustrators, and there are many fine examples in the Opie collection. Indeed, nursery rhymes form the basis of this collection.
I'm deeply interested in what the illustrator can put in, things that I haven't thought of, although I'm supposed to have been thinking about nursery rhymes for the past, 40 years. Nursery rhymes are useful for everybody all through their lives. They give you a nice feeling about life, how ridiculous it is. They're still alive, you see. People have forgotten who wrote them, and so they change subtly, and they stay alive because they're being used and because they're changing. And this is right, apart from the fact that human beings have got very faulty memories, and people like to put in a little of themselves into a rhyme, so they're kept alive. Nursery rhymes are probably the most condensed narrative stories that exist at all. And you think something like Little Miss Muffet. What a long story is told in how many lines? 5 lines?
Children love to hear the same thing ad nauseum. And the more repetitive, the better. In spite of their repetitiveness, what is being repeated is so charming and funny. Amazingly, for the most part, they're all pretty much great stuff. And the kids hear that rhythm and they just love it. They can sing it, they can dance to it, they can memorize it. It's like built into their little bodies, like the little old heartbeats and pulses going. And then there's just the sheer beauty of the language and imagery. It's wonderful for illustrators, wonderful for reading.
Nursery rhymes are great favourites with children. They stimulate their imagination. They're frivolous. Some are nonsensical, some amoral. They are also one side of a battle for the child's mind that began in earliest times when adults realized a child learned from what it saw or was told. Moral and rational books designed to educate and give uplifting instruction were as plentiful as those of nursery rhymes. But at the end of the 18th century, with the Puritan revival, the moralists got the upper hand. Children were increasingly denied works of nonsense and fantasy and instead given books with plain illustration that showed the world as it was.
I think it all arose originally with the publication of Rousseau's Emile. The idea that you should only tell children, because they were so impressionable, what was rational and what was true. And you shouldn't tell them what was not true.
The 18th century had a great feeling that everything a child did ought to be for its improvement. There wasn't to be very much fantasy or daydreaming in its life. And this gathered momentum, this feeling, so that The books at the beginning of the last century, the sort of early decades of the 19th century, were very depressing. All writers and preachers were concerned to try to make children remember their latter end. It was more difficult with pictures. Words seemed to be more forceful. It was much more difficult to illustrate. They didn't hesitate to use tombstones and coffins and children weeping in graveyards.
Not only was a child forced to contemplate death, but the punishments for misbehavior were portrayed through illustration in extreme and gruesome detail. You would be savaged by wild animals. And if you didn't live a godly life as a child, you would go to the bad as an adult. The battle for the child's mind was fierce. But by the 1830s, with an emergent wealthy middle class, attitudes to children began to change.
The child had a different time in the 19th century. The 19th century was affluent enough, you see, at the beginning, to be able to afford to build nurseries in different parts of the house. There was an affluent, a newly affluent class, which had come into being from the Napoleonic Wars, all these merchants getting very rich, providing food for the army and armaments and so forth. Always happens in wars. So all these merchants' families could afford lovely books like John Harris's toy books with the pretty coloured illustration, which cost a lot of money. Also because of the advancing technicalities, the advance in printing techniques and binding techniques and so forth. This wonderful flow of books, especially made for children, that more and more people could afford.
In the middle of the 19th century, you become suddenly aware, even in book illustration, that the child is becoming the centre of the picture. Everything is becoming more child-oriented, and as a result, I think that this affects what the child is going to be allowed to read.
All will be illustrated, but not after the fashion of children's books, in which it seems to be assumed that the lowest kind of art is good enough to give first impressions to a child.
In 1846, a book which heeded those words of Sir Henry Cole put imagination back into children's literature and halted the moralists' crusade. A Book of Nonsense by Edward Lear.
The actual illustrations were so simple. They were part of an archaicizing trend in book illustration, which we find in Struwwelpeter. Peter. It wasn't that the artists couldn't draw figures properly, they just chose to draw them, as it were, like matchstick men or whatever they were. I mean, Lear was a very competent watercolourist, but his illustrated books are very simple in their outline, black and white, and any child could thoroughly enjoy both the rhymes and the pictures. It's just sheer nonsense and sheer pleasure. Nothing didactic about them at all.
He is the beginning of the idiosyncratic illustrator, the personal illustrator, the one who doesn't draw terrific on purpose because we knew he drew terrific when he wished to.
There was a young lady whose nose was so long that it reached to her toes, so she hired an old lady whose conduct was steady to carry that wonderful nose.
The rhymes are so thumbing their nose at authority, thumbing their nose at everything except pleasure. And so here are verses for no other purpose except pleasure. They cannot teach you anything. They cannot teach you anything. And that's his purpose. He's making fun at teaching something. He's inventing a children's book. He's inventing verses. He's going one step beyond the conventional nursery rhyme and bringing it into his own time.
A Book of Nonsense was a great success, much to Lear's surprise. He regarded himself first and foremost as a watercolourist and a painter of wildlife. These parrots were painted in 1832 when Lear was invited to stay at the Earl of Derby's estate to paint the animals in his lordship's zoo. It was during this stay that his famous limericks and nonsense drawings first saw the light of day.
Long ago, in days when much of my time was passed in a country house where children and mirth abounded, the lines beginning, "There was an old man of Tobago," was suggested to me by a valued friend in a form of verse, lending itself to limitless varieties for rhymes and pictures. And thenceforth, the greater part of the original drawings and verses for the first book of nonsense were struck off with a pen, no assistance ever having been given me in any way, but that of uproarious delight and welcome at the appearance of every new absurdity.
Lear's original nonsense drawings were in black and white, and only later coloured in by hand. In response to the people who believed that children should be taught through their reading, here was a book without a moral agenda that made no attempt to teach, only to entertain. Lear's books put nonsense back onto the child's bookshelf. But this was only the beginning. In 1862, Lewis Carroll illustrated the first draft of his own classic nonsense tale called originally Alice's Adventures Underground.
Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations?
I think it was Darton who said he turns morality into a sort of unmorality. He turns all the acceptable values upside down. He takes poems of Isaac Watts, which every reading child had to learn as part of its upbringing, and he turns Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star into Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat, and like a tea tray in the sky, and all this sort of thing, which you can imagine the children of that period, as of now, would absolutely fall apart over. Great pleasure.
Carroll reworked the book and decided that for its publication, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland should be illustrated not by his own drawings, but by those of an established artist. Because Carroll had already done his own drawings, his relationship with Tenniel, the newcomer to his book, was a stormy one.
Mr. Tenniel is the only artist who has drawn for me who has resolutely refused to use a model and declared he no more needed one than I should need a multiplication table to work a mathematical problem. I venture to think that he was mistaken, and that for want of a model, he drew several pictures of Alice entirely out of proportion. Head decidedly too large and feet decidedly too small.
Unfortunately, being an illustrator, I know what it's like to work with an author who thinks he can draw. But I think in the particular case of Carroll, he was working with a witch. That man did know what the pictures looked like. And I don't know how right or true to fact it is, but the stories I've heard where he would forcibly dictate the images, Well, Tenniel may have crabbed about it later that he was forced to do that, but in fact, if it's true, these stories, he did do what he was told, which means he agreed. He wouldn't have done them otherwise. So he did take the direction pointed out by Carroll. In thus doing, I think he's created some of the best illustrations anybody ever created, and I don't think he ever got past them in his whole career.
Alice was unlike anything seen before. A mixture of fantasy and nonsense. But when published in 1865, it was the pictures that seemed to get more attention than the story.
Mr. Tenniel has illustrated a little work, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with extraordinary grace. Look at the first chapter of this volume and note the rabbit at the head of it. His umbrella is tucked under his arm, and he is taking the watch out of his pocket to see what o'clock it is. The neatness of touch may be seen in a dozen other vignettes throughout the volume, the letterpress of which is by Mr. Lewis Carroll and may be best described as an excellent piece of nonsense. This pretty and funny book ought to become a great favourite with children. It has this advantage, that it has no moral and that it does not teach anything. It is, in fact, pure sugar throughout, and is without any of that bitter foundation which some people imagine ought to be at the bottom of all children's books.
Nevertheless, it was Carroll who had seen off the Puritan moralists, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was a great triumph for nonsense. Carroll and Tenniel had a further success with Alice Through the Looking Glass, but this was to be the last book they worked on together. A contemporary of Tenniel, who also worked in black and white, producing beautiful illustration for children, was the pre-Raphaelite painter Arthur Hughes. Some of his finest work can be seen in The Back of the North Wind, a fantasy story on the borderline between dream and reality, by the writer George MacDonald.
George MacDonald had a certain educational, evangelical background in mind when he was writing these stories, and he wrote one which I can remember reading as a child, which is At the Back of the North Wind. He got Arthur Hughes as illustrator, who beautifully matched this magical quality, again in black and white. These people had no need of colour. Arthur Hughes could show the north wind in a very moving sort of way.
Arthur Hughes also produced a charming series of pictures for Christina Rossetti's book of rhymes, called Sing Song. Another pre-Raphaelite painter, who, unlike Hughes, took advantage of the new colour printing techniques and produced these illustrations for children, was the artist Eleanor Vere Boyle. In The Story Without End, she set her lumpy children firmly in the world of fairyland. These elves inhabit a much richer vision of fairyland. It's a world created by the artist Richard Doyle, his finest work and most ambitious use of the 19th century's new colour techniques. Dickie Doyle came from an artistic family. Though best known at the time as a punch artist, it's his work for children for which he is now remembered. He was a child prodigy who loved legends, dragons and monsters, and at 17 drew these frightening illustrations for Jack the Giant Killer. He brought a unique imagination to everything he did, and his work demonstrates that by the middle of the 19th century, books for children could be entertaining and fun. In 1850, at the age of 26, he had a great success in black and white with his pictures for John Ruskin's fairy tale, The King of the Golden River. Doyle's masterpiece, In Fairyland, was published in 1870. Though commissioned, Doyle was given a completely free hand by the publishers. The result was a great outpouring of ideas and imagination as he created a complete fairy fantasy world.
What's so strange to me is it's a school of illustration I dislike intensely, is the grandiose, painted fairyland visionary thing. That's just bull. Can't stand it. And he's really on the fine edge of that. I mean, just another step and he's over on the wrong side. But Doyle does a tightrope act on that is miraculous. He just stays on the right side. He's just acid enough, just sharp enough, just shrewd enough, just tongue-in-cheek enough, just comical enough that it doesn't get sappy sweet. Well, actually it does. On occasion, it does. And Fairyland is not perfect. It does slip over into those sort of vacant, pudgy people lying under green leaves. He does unfortunately do it, but not to an extent that it all spoils the work. It has that freshness and airiness that is wonderful. That is Midsummer Night's Dreamy. He's a first-rate illustrator, staying on the side of the vision and not getting himself locked in or spoiling it by inserting himself into it. That's a great book.
In Fairyland was a sensational success, due to the new colour printing processes of Edmund Evans, who used up to 12 separate colour blocks for each picture and made it one of the triumphs of Victorian book production.
I know that it's the correct thing to say this is marvellous. I personally am not terribly fond of those faces of his little fairies and elves, but the colour printing is beautiful. I think it is the colour that makes it.
As we've seen, there was a golden age of imaginative books for children in the 19th century. But what had happened to those books designed to educate and instruct?
By the time you get to the middle of the century, obviously didactic books were still printed and published, and still are for that matter. We're never without people who want to improve our minds one way or the other. And even today, of course, there is still a certain morality in our books, because on the whole, good triumphs and the bad get what's coming to them even today. And there'd be an outcry if they didn't. But there was much more fun in books. Children were now allowed to read, to enjoy reading for itself.
In Fairyland was published when Richard Doyle was 46 and was his final success. He died 13 years later, and it was this, In Fairyland, that he was remembered for.
He left behind him the memory of a singularly sweet and noble type of English gentleman, and of an artist of most excellent fancy, the most graceful and sympathetic of the limners of Fairyland. In Oberon's court, he would have been appointed Sergeant Painter.
The artistry and imagination of Richard Doyle, Arthur Hughes, Edward Lear, and John Tenniel enabled nonsense and fantasy to hold back the moralists' crusade. The child was put centre stage, and everything was now possible in books for children. The way was open for the great illustrators such as Beatrix Potter and E.H. Shepard, who were to come.